Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, heute in einer etwas kleineren Runde im neuen Jahr, zu dem ich Ihnen natürlich noch alles Gute wünsche. Wir setzen heute Abend unser Programm zum Non Finito, Unfinished, Unfertigen fort mit einem Beitrag aus der Musikgeschichte, aus der besonderen Musikgeschichte Irlands. Die Komponistin, Vokalistin, Performerin, auf keine dieser Rollen lässt sie sich so leicht festlegen, Jennifer Walshe, die ich sehr herzlich an dieser Stelle begrüße, wird heute Abend dazu vortragen. 4 Vorträge haben wir bisher in diesem Semester zum Thema des Unfertigen, des Non Finito gehört, aus der Literatur- und Kulturgeschichte und der aktuellen Literatur- und Kulturtheorie. Es bestätigte sich unsere Annahme, dass das Unfertige der Werke keineswegs ein Defizit war und ist, sondern vielmehr im Nichtvollendeten eine Kreativität wirksam ist, die das Werden, das fortlaufende Experiment und die intensive Spurensuche herausfordert. Der Kunsthistoriker Peter Geimer sprach über die unvollendete Vergangenheit in den Nachbildern der Geschichte, den Widerspruch, dass das Vergangene einerseits endgültig vorbei ist und andererseits doch stets als unvollendet wahrgenommen wird, gerade in der Historienmalerei. Die Literaturwissenschaftlerin Barbara Naumann konnte zeigen, wie in Prousts großem Erzählwerk die unendliche Rede das große Ganze überformt. Der Autor Ulrich Pelzer sprach über seine Poetik des Mittendrin und den darin geborgenen Möglichkeitssinn gegen alles Konzeptionelle. Und der Kunsthistoriker und Philosoph Georges Tilly Ubermann stellte in den Mittelpunkt seines wahrnehmungstheoretischen Vortrags die andauernde, nie zum Abschluss gelangende Geste des Uprising, des Sich-Erhebens und des Aufstands. Was bei unseren Erkundungen noch fehlte, der Erfahrungsbereich der Musik, das finden wir auf besondere Art und Weise in den vielfältigen Darstellungen und Vorführungen von Jennifer Walshe. Margarete Zander, die neben ihr sitzt, die bereits in unserer Reihe zu Musik und Politik in inspirierender Weise die Ausführungen der Komponistin Tanja Leon begleitet hat, wird den heutigen Abend moderieren. Viele von Ihnen werden Sie aus der Sendung Musik der Gegenwart im RBB Kulturradio kennen, in der sie zeitgenössische Komponisten und ihre Werke vorstellt und auch als langjährige Leiterin des Festivals Ultraschall das wesentliche Entwicklungen der zeitgenössischen Musik aufzeigt und aktuelle Werke in wegweisenden Aufführungen präsentiert. Margarete Zander bewegt als freie Journalistin seit 30 Jahren den Diskurs über neue Musik, ist im besten Sinne Vermittlerin, die es versteht, für das Neue in der Musik zu interessieren und gar zu begeistern. Sie moderiert Konzerte gleichermaßen auf Tuchfühlung mit den Musikern wie dem Publikum, als Live-Sendung fürs Radio oder gern auch außerhalb der Konzertsäle, wie hier an der Universität. Ihr Engagement für die Musik der Gegenwart bedeutet aber keineswegs, dass sie nicht auch in der klassischen Musik zu Hause ist. Das zeigen beispielsweise ihre Gespräche mit Daniel Barenboim oder auch ihr Buch über die Klarinettistin Sabine Meyer. Margarete Zander wird Ihnen nun Jennifer Walshe vorstellen, nach dem Vortrag mit ihr ins Gespräch kommen, das dann, wie gewohnt, fürs Publikum geöffnet wird. Liebe Jennifer Walshe, liebe Margarete Zander, wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie heute Abend hier sind.
Ja, einen wunderschönen guten Abend. Lieben Dank, liebe Frau Wagner. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie mich eingeladen haben, das heute Abend zu moderieren. Denn für mich ist es immer noch mal ein neues Nachdenken über die Komponistin, die mir da gegenüber sitzt, Jennifer Walshe. Wir haben uns heute Mittag schon getroffen und verabredet, dass wir diesen ersten Teil auch gemeinsam gestalten. Denn Jennifer Walshe gehört nicht zu den Komponistinnen und Komponisten, bei denen man zwei Namen nennt und dann heißt es, ach ja, alles klar, wer bei dem oder bei ihr studiert hat, der wird Karriere machen. Also sie hat weder bei Helmut Lachenmann studiert, noch bei Wolfgang Riem studiert und wie sie eine so wunderbare Komponistin, Persönlichkeit, Künstlerin geworden ist, das möchte ich ganz gerne anhand ihrer Biografie erzählen, in wenigen Stationen, und wer könnte es besser mit Leben erfüllen und uns die Persönlichkeiten vorstellen, die ihr Leben geprägt haben, als sie selber. Also wird sie kurz zwischenhaken. Jennifer Walshe ist, das möchte ich ganz zu Beginn sagen, für mich die Lady Gaga der neuen Musik. Warum sage ich das? Weil sie in kein Kästchen passt und weil ich Sie bitten möchte, Ihre Kästchen jetzt auch zu öffnen. Das Grenzenlose, das Multipersönliche, das liebend gern in verschiedene Rollen schlüpfen, das ist ihre Art, damit umzugehen. Natürlich habe ich sie heute Mittag gefragt, ob ich das sagen dürfte, öffentlich auf der Bühne. Da hat sie gelacht und gesagt, eigentlich ist ja das Einzige, was ich mit Lady Gaga und Madonna gemeinsam habe, die Größe. Aber ich glaube, da ist noch ein bisschen mehr, vor allen Dingen auch die Power auf der Bühne. Und ich freue mich wahnsinnig auf den Vortrag gleich. Und da wird man so ein bisschen davon mitbekommen. Ich hätte Sie auch gerne gebeten, hier mit Ihrer Stimme zu performen, weil man da diese Präsenz spürt, die wirklich bis in den letzten Winkel dieses Raumes reichen würde. Aber sie ist ein bisschen erkältet und muss daher wirklich ihre Stimme schonen. Das ist dann doch zu gefährlich, wenn man da mit der Stimme performt. Jennifer Walshe ist 1974 in Dublin in Irland geboren. Schon da möchte ich einhaken und sagen, das ist ganz wichtig für sie, weil ihr Vater bei Guinness gearbeitet hat als Jugendlicher, später bei IBM. Und für sie war ihr Vater aber stets eine Persönlichkeit, der Kunst gemacht hat, der Bilder gemalt hat. Sie hat ihn gar nicht als den Arbeiter wahrgenommen, sondern als den Künstler. Die Mutter ist Schriftstellerin. Sie liebt Hamlet, hat den oft genug zu Hause zitiert. Und als die Familie in San Francisco war für 6 Monate, der Vater hatte von IBM dort eine Austauschstelle bekommen, da hat sie die Trompete entdeckt. Sie wollte die Trompete unbedingt mit zurücknehmen nach Dublin. Ihr Vater hat ihr eine Querflöte geschenkt und sie sagt, sie hat nicht mal den Kasten aufgemacht. Sie hat gesagt, sie wollte einfach Trompete spielen. Sie hat dann tatsächlich an der Royal Conservatory of Scotland Trompete studiert. Und wenn man ein Instrument studiert, dann muss man auch zwangsläufig Kompositionsunterricht nehmen. Und weil sie so gerne Dinge erfunden hat und selber gemacht hat, ist sie zu John Maxwell Geddes gegangen. Ich habe sie gefragt, ob sie denn da richtige Werke komponieren musste. Und eines der ersten Stücke war ein Stück für 4 Trompeten. And you still use it, the piece for 4 trumpets. So it's not embarrassing, so it's just music, trumpet players like to play. Also Trompeter spielen das einfach gern.
I think, and just to warn you, I'm going to speak in English, so I'm sorry I can't speak fluent German. I'm an Irish person, and Irish people have a tendency to speak quite quickly. So at any point, if you can't understand me, please shout and say, hey, repeat it. I won't feel it's rude if you interrupt me. I think that composers were supposed to find our early works embarrassing, and of course we find them embarrassing. But I also think it's it's nice to sort of approach them with some love and rework them and see them in new ways. In the way that we try to extend compassion towards ourselves. When we see photographs of ourselves when we were younger, we think, oh, I looked great. You know, why did I hate myself so much? You know, and you think, let's try and extend that compassion now. I think for young composers now, they're never going to have that experience because everything they make is on SoundCloud, usually the day after they made it. I'm old enough to remember composers burning their scores and there never being a copy available, you know, when they sort of went through a period. And I'm old enough that, you know, we received cassette copies of our performances, which we would then dub onto other cassettes, you know. So I think it's very, very different now. People will always have a very different relationship with work they create early, maybe be more gentle with it. So I'm trying to be gentle with my work because it's still an interesting document, even if it's embarrassing.
I don't think it's really embarrassing. Also sie holt immer noch aus diesen alten Werken, geht sie mit einer gewissen Nachsicht mit sich selber um und sie sagt, jeder, der heute seine Werke schon in der Soundcloud hat, der hat eigentlich keine Chance mehr, das nochmal so zu erleben und sich mit seinen alten Werken auseinanderzusetzen. Und als sie diese ersten Stücke aufgenommen haben, die existieren also in der Kassettenaufnahme tatsächlich und sie macht dann Kopien davon und bindet sie heute manchmal in ihre Performances ein. Then you went to Kevin Volans, also der nächste Komponist, zu dem sie ging, ein richtiger Komponist in Dublin war Kevin Volans und da hat sie sich zum ersten Mal auch als Komponistin nicht mehr so alleine gefühlt. Kevin Volans hatte ein Haus, in dem er seine Komponistenschüler gerne unterhielt, bekochte, man sprach über Gott und die Welt und tatsächlich hat sie da gemerkt, was es sein kann, das Leben eines Komponisten zu führen. The life of a composer, of a cultural person.
I mean, with Kevin, that was very much the case in that Kevin, he now lives in Cove and Cork, but at the time he lived in a stable house, in the Knockmaroon estate. So if you can imagine one of these huge, beautiful country houses that the English came and built on our land, and you know, and you had the stables where the horses were kept. That's where Kevin, he rented one of those stables. That was his house. And we'll come back to the Guinness family, but the people who owned Knockmaroon House were the Guinnesses, the Guinness family. So Kevin would have all of us over and we would come to his house and, you know, he had Japanese teapots and Mondrian paintings he had copied by hand and painted himself onto canvases. You know, and he would cook for us. I was saying to you this afternoon, it was the first time I'd ever tasted polenta, you know, and things like that. I grew up, it sounds like I grew up in a very artistic bourgeois family, but my parents are both working class. You know, I sort of grew up, I didn't eat asparagus till I was 19, you know, so these sort of experiences of feeling like you have access to cultural capital, you know that this wine goes with this. A little bit of that Kevin shared with all of us. And we were very much rough, young Irish students, and you know, he would get out his very, very nice Lagavulin Scotch whiskey and actually give it to us. So he was, for me, he was a very important teacher, very generous with his time. He had known Morton Feldman very well, so he talked about Feldman a lot. He played us recordings of Alvin Lucier, Claude Vivier, talked about a lot of American experimental music that was quite difficult to access at that time, that was very much an imaginary world in our heads as students that we had read about, but we hadn't necessarily listened to.
Also da ging er eine ganze neue Welt auf, weil Kevin Volans nicht nur diese Art hatte, als Künstler zu sieben in einem Landhaus, was wunderschön eingerichtet war und die Art hatte mit italienischer, ich übersetze das so ein bisschen, ja, für einige, oder ist das gar nicht nötig? Wer möchte eine Übersetzung auf Deutsch? Bisschen? Einer? Zwei? Okay, also es war die Welt der Künstler, die ja aufging, und zwar alles das, was das bedeutet, zu philosophieren, in Gedanken neue Welten aufzubauen, sich mit Menschen zu beschäftigen und Musik zu beschäftigen, von der sie noch nie was gehört hatte, also Morton Feldman aus Amerika. Erfahrungen, die man damals nicht so einfach übers Internet machen konnte, und das war heute Mittag auch schon ein Thema. Das Internet hat doch vieles verändert in dieser Rezeption. Sie ist nämlich dann nach Chicago gegangen, weil sie das Gefühl hatte, sie wollte mal an eine Universität gehen, wo sie keinen Kontakt mehr hatte zu der Welt, aus der sie eigentlich kam. Heute ist man ja übers Internet und über alles verbunden, man kann in den Soundclouds alles erfahren. Damals wusste sie von dieser Northern University in Chicago eigentlich nur, dass es 6 Kompositionslehrer gab und dass die alle einen unterschiedlichen Stil haben. Welcher Stil das genau war, das wusste sie nicht, aber sie hatte das Gefühl, da würde sie schon was finden, was auf sie irgendwie passen könnte. Dann kam sie zu Michael Pissarro, der kam aus Buffalo, ist Gitarrist und hat hier bei Wandelweise auch mitgespielt, manche mögen ihn vielleicht kennen. Und ganz wichtig war der Einfluss von Amnon Wollman. Und das ist ein Künstler aus Israel, der zuerst beim Fernsehen war, dann Musik studiert hat und dann an Stanford bei John Schauning studiert hat, also sich mit Elektronik beschäftigt hat. Und der hat sie zum ersten Mal sehr persönlich angesehen in ihrer Künstlerpersönlichkeit. Man kann sagen, Amnon Wollman hat ihr Dinge gezeigt, die sie selber hat, von denen sie selber nichts wusste.
I think by the time I went to study with Amnon, at that time, if a composer was studying for master's or PhD, they would do their dissertation on ligeti or kagel. And when I went with Amnon, I ended up writing about things like gender depictions and sexual depictions that you can hear in vocal timbres. So all of a sudden the world opened up because I started thinking about how gender, how sexuality, how the body, how all these elements played in sound, things that I'd never heard about before. So he introduced me to, say, for example, feminist musicology, you know, which was a topic up to that point I didn't know existed. You know, I was only 23. And I sort of was still finding my way. So with Amnon, he tried, I always think he's a multi-dimensional person, and he tried to sort of see that sound was something. If from Kevin I got the idea that you should be a well-rounded composer and read books and know about art and know about film, with Amnon, it was sort of saying, you don't just know about these things, you know about pop music, you know about queer studies, you know about gender and sexuality, things like that, and you think about them through sound.
Amnon hat sie angeschaut als Persönlichkeit und ihr wirklich gesagt, wo ihre Stärken liegen könnten und ihr überhaupt eine Idee davon gegeben, dass es sowas gibt wie eine weibliche Musikwissenschaft oder den weiblichen Blick auf die eigene Stimme, auf das Timbre der Stimme und was man daraus machen kann. Und überhaupt die Stimme, vorher hatte sie Trompete gespielt und da fing sie an zu improvisieren. Und das Schöne an dieser Northern University war, dass alle, sowohl die Lehrenden als auch die Studierenden in der Improvisation auf einem Niveau waren, dass sie alle mitgemacht haben. Sie sagt, sie hatte überhaupt keine Scheu, mit zu improvisieren, wie das hier manchmal ist, ach ja, was können die anderen denken oder wie gut kann ich das, ich kann das gar nicht. Sie ist sowieso ein mutiger Mensch, aber es waren dort alle und es gab auch gar nicht die Chance auszubüchsen oder zu sagen, ich mache das jetzt nicht mit. Das gehörte einfach dazu und alle haben das gemacht, sowohl die Lehrer als auch die Schüler. Und das war doch ein Moment, der ihr sehr viel Kraft auch für das weitere Leben gegeben hat. Und Amnon hat zu ihr gesagt, warum machst du nicht weiter mit der Stimme?
My way into using my voice was very, very organic. I came from playing the trumpet, so I suppose I had a lot of breath control and I'd done an awful lot of breathing exercises and working with my lungs. But a lot of the singers I know, they're very, very worried about damaging their voice all the time. And especially if they come through a bel canto singing tradition, there's huge concern about the voice, and you see singers saying, I can't talk today because I have a performance, and and scarves, and I look the part tonight, I suppose. But because I came to using my voice through free improvisation, I had a very different relationship, because I evolved it by just exploring it. Derek Bailey, the amazing free improviser, the guitarist, talks about, in his book, Improvisation, talks about how improvisers do a research on their instrument, and they find these new sounds, and they just do it for themselves, and they do it day after day for their whole lives. And that, for me, is what working with the voice is. And so I approached it in that way. I never had formal vocal training. My voice was trained through playing with people who played no input mixer and trying to imitate those sounds and trying to figure out ways to do it. And it was very liberating after being in a Musikhochschule, where there's so much tension, and you're supposed to practice, if you're a trumpet player, 4 hours a day in the room alone practicing, and you have to be very careful. If you cut your lip or if something goes wrong, to be in a free improvisation context where it's really about your technique, you build your technique with discipline, you're still rigorous, but you're rigorous in a different way, and you answer to yourself.
Ihr großes Glück war, dass sie Trompeterin war und nie Angst hatte, ihre Stimme zu verletzen, oder dass ihr keiner gesagt hat, ach, heute Abend muss ich singen, dann darf ich den ganzen Tag nicht sprechen. Also sie ist ganz anders mit der Stimme umgegangen als andere, die vom Sängerischen gekommen sind. Sie hatte sehr viel mehr Freiheit von Anfang an, ihre Stimme auch zu finden und ihre eigene Persönlichkeit dadurch zu entwickeln. Sie hat mit dem Geiger John Shen zusammengearbeitet, ein Duo gehabt, Noli Me Tangere. Und das Interessante an diesem Duo ist, die beiden haben sich einfach regelmäßig getroffen. Das ist das ganze Geheimnis. Sie haben nicht gewartet, ach, haben wir ein Projekt, können wir irgendwo auftreten, können wir irgendwas machen, gibt es Geld für irgendwas, sondern sie haben einfach gesagt, wir treffen uns einmal in der Woche, 6 Stunden, und wir arbeiten zusammen und haben das aufgenommen, haben das jeder für sich zu Hause wieder abgehört und sind dann beim nächsten Mal zusammengekommen und haben was daran verändert. Also das ist auch ihre Philosophie, wenn sie heute als Professorin unterrichtet. Sie hat gerade ein Semester in Bremen an der Universität. Das, was sie vermittelt, ist, macht es einfach. Macht es, sucht euch Leute, mit denen ihr was machen könnt, zu denen ihr Vertrauen habt. Das muss nicht gleich auf die Bühne. Ihr müsst erst mal lernen, wo eure Grenzen sind und wo eure Persönlichkeit eigentlich ist. Wo ist der Kern der Dinge? Und das ist doch eine sehr intuitive und auf der anderen Seite auch sehr kritische Art, mit sich selber umzugehen. Wer sich einmal selber beim Tonband aufgenommen und hinterher abgehört hat, der weiß, wie skeptisch man ist, wie kritisch man miteinander ist. Und da war auch Amnon Wollmann jemand, der gesagt hat, nee, geh mal diesen Weg weiter. Und dann hatte sie ein Duo mit Tony Conrad zusammen, und das war dann der nächste große Schritt. Also wieder auch eine ältere Persönlichkeit, die einfach Vertrauen hatte, die hat sich angesehen, welcher Student, welche Studentin, Performerin, Composer kommt da auf mich zu und was sind die wesentlichen Eigenschaften, was könnte dieser Mensch an sich weiterentwickeln. Und das ist einfach das Wunderbare in dieser Biografie, wie sich die Künstlerpersönlichkeit entwickelt hat. Sie ist Menschen begegnet, die sie persönlich angeguckt haben, und sie hat den Mut gehabt, das zu tun, was die Menschen ihr empfohlen haben. Was hat Tony Conrad gesagt?
Tony Conrad, for those of you who don't know him, was an amazing American filmmaker and musician who passed away last year. He was 75 when he passed, or he was just about to turn 75 when he passed away. So when I knew Tony, he was 69 going on 70. And he was incredibly open-minded, incredibly open to younger artists. That was a huge lesson that I learned from Tony, was that you should always be open. And always, we say, network down. Don't network up to the people who are more famous than you. Do projects with people who are starting out. So with Tony, I would do projects where Tony and I would be improvising, and there'd be 2 kids in their 20s, you know, soldering circuit boards together until they exploded. You know, we would do these, we would work with whoever, because we just wanted to work and try things out. And Tony was still doing that right through to the end of his life. But he encouraged me very deeply to start working with text and start working with text in my improvisation, and then that has also come into the pieces that I write. Within free improvisation, there's still a lot of free improvisers who are not very comfortable with text. It's already a little problematic that there's a voice on the stage with free improvisers, because our brains, how we organize sonic information coming into our brains, is we prioritize sounds made by the human voice over all other sounds. So therefore, if you're seeing a vocalist in a string quartet or a vocalist in an orchestra, even if you decide, I don't care, they're singing in, Japanese and I don't even understand what they're saying, your brain is still maximizing that vocal sound coming in and prioritizing it, because from an evolutionary perspective, that's what we had to do. So if you're neurotypical, if you have a typically structured brain, or a brain that works in the typical way, you will be processing that vocal information before everything else. So if you have the very democratic dream of total equality that we have in a free improvisation situation, something is ruptured when a voice is introduced into that equation. That's also an opportunity, I think. It's an opportunity to really explore a lot of interesting things. So as I began working as a vocalist, as an improviser, I never used text. I always just, would be imitating and trying to do extended techniques. If anything, I tried to make my voice not sound like a voice. But with Tony, I think he's one of the most free improvisers I ever worked with, in that really you could do anything. There's a lot of free improvisers that if, like, we would turn up at a studio that Tony owned. He had these studios dotted around New York, like CIA safe houses for spies or something. And he would say, well, go to this one today. And you'd go into a room and it would just be full of like old ladies' clothes and doors. And he'd say, let's get dressed up in these old lady clothes and we'll arrange the doors so that we're filming ourselves through the doors improvising. And we would do things like that. So it was for a kid who grew up in Ireland and felt very, very, very far away from any sort of international avant-garde, to be in a studio wearing old women's clothing with Tony Conrad was truly a joyous, life-enriching experience.
Ich glaube, man kann sich wirklich vorstellen, welche Freude sie gehabt hat, mit Tony Conrad zusammenzuarbeiten, der immer wieder neue Ideen hatte und der ihr die Möglichkeit gegeben hatte, sich einfach mal, möchte ich sagen, auszutoben, als Persönlichkeit auch auszuprobieren, was das Schauspielerische anging, was den Klang anging. Sie haben Dinge zum Explodieren gebracht und einfach Spaß daran gehabt und sich dann darüber unterhalten, wo ist das Kunst, wo stehe ich als Künstler im Grunde? Und Tony hat ihr zum ersten Mal gesagt, dass man als Sänger natürlich sehr dominant ist. Das liegt in der menschlichen Natur, dass der Sänger, wenn er gemeinsam mit Instrumentalisten auftritt, immer dominant ist, egal wie sehr man versucht, sich zurückzunehmen, auch in der Improvisation. Wir reagieren als Menschen zuerst auf die menschliche Stimme. Und sie hatte zuvor immer versucht, ihre menschliche Stimme wie ein Instrument zu benutzen und sich zu integrieren, gerade beim Improvisieren, weil sie das gespürt hat, dass sie auch über den Blickkontakt, was sie heute exzessiv oder intensiv nutzt im Verhältnis zum Publikum, dieses sich eigentlich zurückzustellen, und da ist ihr bewusst geworden, dass man das aber auch als Kraft, als Energie nutzen kann, und von Tony hat sie gelernt, auch Geschichten zu erzählen. Die Amerikaner sind ja überhaupt wahnsinnige Geschichtenerzähler. Und da hat sie aber den Mut bekommen, über ihre Grenzen hinauszugehen, Neues auszuprobieren, und er hat sie einfach ermutigt, das zu tun. Northern University war ein sehr großer Fundus an Möglichkeiten, der sich da auftat, nicht nur wegen der 6 Kompositionslehrer, sondern auch, weil das ganze Harry Partsch-Instrumentarium da gestanden hat. Also weil man schon immer über den Tellerrand gesehen hatte und während woanders, das hat sie ja vorhin so schön gesagt, über Ligeti und Kagel promoviert wurde, konnte man da einfach über das Weibliche in der Stimme sich erkunden. Und sie wurde auch zuerst aufgefordert, zu einem Konzert von Meredith Monk zu gehen und sich überhaupt auf eine ganz andere Art, auf ihre eigene Art oder ihren eigenen Weg zu finden durch den Dschungel der Musik. Und davon profitiert sie heute noch, weil sie ein Gespür dafür entwickelt hat, was sie selber gerne auf der Bühne sehen und hören möchte. Und das ist das Besondere an ihr, dieses Gespür. Auch heute wird ja so viel über die 4. Wand gesprochen, also über das Publikum. Wie baut man diese 4. Wand ab? Wie baut man das Verhältnis zum Publikum auf? Und da ist sie natürlich als Performerin mit ihrer Stimme, sagt sie selber, in einer besseren Lage als die Instrumentalisten, die sich hinter der Geige verstecken. Sie kann das Publikum wirklich anschauen. Und ich selbst habe in Donaueschingen ihre Performance Total Mountain gesehen und ich kann mich sehr gut erinnern, als ich da saß 2014, Sie kennen das Donaueschinger Publikum, es hat sich verjüngt in den letzten Jahren mit dem Redakteur Armin Köhler, der auch eine große Rolle gespielt hat, weil er ihr ein unglaubliches Vertrauen entgegengebracht hat. Aber es sitzen eben immer noch die alten Männer mit den weißen Haaren, die als Kritiker das nach außen tragen, was gut oder schlecht ist, die auch über ihre Erfahrung sehr viel Fundiertes schreiben oder sagen können. Und sie kam auf die Bühne und sieht diese Herren in den ersten Reihen, wo sie manchmal doch auch gewöhnt ist, in Clubs aufzutreten, anderen Performances. Und ich saß im Publikum und dachte, na, ist das die richtige Performance für Donaueschingen? Passt das wirklich an diesen Ort? Man hat großes Vertrauen zu Armin Köhler. Ich gehe als Journalistin grundsätzlich natürlich in alle Konzerte, in alle Aufführungen in Donaueschingen. Und dachte, ob das nicht vielleicht besser ins Berghain passt. Passt das eigentlich hier hin? Und dann dachte ich, du hättest es nie mitbekommen, dass sowas überhaupt ist, wenn nicht in Donaueschingen, wo dann? Ich merkte einfach, ich selbst habe schon die Schere im Kopf und denke, hier kommen Komponisten, die schreiben für Orchester, die schreiben für Quartett, die schreiben für Ensemble und die schreiben so in der Nachfolge schon von Ligeti oder von anderen, so dass man es in Noten lesen kann. Und plötzlich stand was ganz anderes auf der Bühne. Und Jennifer spürte diese Skepsis schon in den ersten Reihen, sah die älteren Herrschaften vorne sitzen und fing aber an, über das Internet zu erzählen, weil sie sich sehr kritisch mit dem Internet, mit den neuen Medien auseinandersetzt und sagt, dass sie es aber auch benutzt, wenn sie mal krank ist und erforschen will, wie man mit dieser Krankheit umgeht oder was das überhaupt sein könnte, wenn sie sich nicht wohlfühlt. Und plötzlich spürte sie ein Raunen aus den ersten Reihen, dass man ihr also beipflichtete. Schon hatte sie das Publikum und auch die älteren Herrschaften ganz auf ihrer Seite, weil sich alle in diese Situation versetzen könnten und plötzlich öffnete sich sowas im Publikum und das ist einfach die Möglichkeit, diese 4. Wand niederzureißen und man muss nicht über Anekdoten kommen, aber doch über gemeinsame Erfahrungen, den Austausch mit dem Publikum im direkten Blickkontakt herzustellen. Und das ist das Wunderbare. Und jetzt war sie mit dem Arditi-Quartett unterwegs mit ihrem Stück Everything is Important und da waren sie auf der Tournee genauso im Mozartsaal in Wien, bei Wien Modern, wie auf einem Festival in Amsterdam, in einem Club, in dem Irvin Arditi und seine Kollegen noch nie gespielt hatten, wo die Leute vor ihnen auf dem Boden lagen sozusagen und plötzlich eine ganz andere Atmosphäre herrschte und an allen Orten hat diese Performance so einen ganz anderen Charakter bekommen und sie liebt es einfach, diesen Charakter zu wechseln. Charakterwechseln ist das Stichwort für das Ensemble Grupat was sie gegründet hat. Deshalb kam ich auf den Vergleich mit Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga liebt es ja, sich in verschiedenen Rollen zu präsentieren. Manchmal glaubt man gar nicht, dass es die gleiche Person ist. Und Gruppat ist ein Ensemble und das ganze Ensemble ist Jennifer Walshe. In 12 oder mehr verschiedenen Rollen kommt sie als unterschiedlichste Komponistinnen, mal mit japanischem Flair, mal mit finnischem. You play with the roles.
With Gruppat, it's a project. I'll actually talk about it during the talk a little bit, so I'll introduce it. But it's basically a project. It started with 9 different alter egos. It was a commission from a public art commission in Ireland. And so it gave me an opportunity to completely break down any barriers between different genres, because I just made this work and people didn't know it was me. Because for 2 years I kept it completely anonymous. I kept it a secret. So people, apart from curators or producers, audience members didn't know that I made this work. When I did a solo concert, they would think, oh, there's a piece by Jennifer, and then a piece by Euchern O'Connor, who's some Japanese-Irish guy, and then by Detlev Averans, who's an Estonian woman, and by the Dowager Marchilov, who's a drag queen. And they didn't know that it was all me. So it was a way to sort of experiment very widely in a very protected space.
Also auf der einen Seite ein Spiel mit den Rollen, auf der anderen Seite auch eine Auseinandersetzung mit den Kompositionswegen, mit anderen Kulturen, mit der Art Musik zu hören, einfach diese Multipersönlichkeit auf die Bühne zu bringen als Ensemble. Das Letzte, und darum geht es heute, das ist Estoch. Wenn man es im Internet liest, das ist eine wunderbare Webseite, auf der man sich, sag mal so, verlaufen kann, dann liest man A-I-S-T-E-A-C-H, also Ice Teach. Ich wusste wirklich nicht, wie man das lesen sollte. Sie lacht, aber es ist ein irisches Wort und das heißt Ashtoch. Strange, wondrous, queer findet man als Übersetzung, also seltsam, wundersam, schrullig meint dieses Wort. Und das ist das, was Jennifer uns heute vorstellen wird. Herzlichen Dank.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk for about 45 minutes about this project Ashtoch. Before I start talking about Ashtoch, I feel I need to sort of give a very brief background to 3 important aspects of being Irish. So, you know, as Margareta said, I was born in Dublin. I was raised in Ireland, but my family lived in San Francisco for 6 months, and we also lived in Amsterdam for 3 years because my dad worked for IBM. So I also had a very strange sense of going away and coming back to Ireland, at times being bullied for having a strange accent, you know, at times feeling like I fitted in, at times not. And that's something that I've sort of dealt with in my work a lot. But there's 3 very important things like that sort of are key memories of mine from being a child and being Irish and thinking about music and sound and art. One is a story about Finn McCool and the Fianna. Margareta, you did a very good job saying Ashtoch. The Irish language is the most, I think it's supposed to be the most difficult pronunciation rules of any language that uses the Roman alphabet. So that is Finn McCool. As you can see, most of the letters in the 3rd word are silent. So it's quite a difficult language for people who don't speak Irish. But Finn McCool was a very important hero in Irish mythology. He's a mythological character, a very important warrior who was the head of a troop of warriors called the Fianna. And that's why still in Ireland we have political parties called Fianna Fáil. That comes from that mythological idea of a band of warriors. So Finn McCool and the Fianna, they weren't just fighters, they were also sort of sensitive guys who liked to write poetry. You had to memorize a lot of poetry to be in the Fianna, so you were sort of like the samurai, you were sort of a cultured soldier. And there's a famous story from the mythological cycles that they're sitting around the fire one night and they're discussing what is the finest music in the world, what is the best music in the world. And one of the Fiannas says, oh, it's the sound of the fiddle, the violin. And another member of the Fiannas says, it's the sound of the pipes. It's the sound of the waves breaking on the seashore. It's the sound of the wind through the trees. And then they come to Finn McCool and they say, what is it? What do you think is the greatest music in the world? And he says, it's the music of what happens. I think was passiert, that would be a translation. So when I found this story, I really felt like, oh, John Cage really should have known this story, because Finn McCool was there, 10,000 years ago, thinking in this way, thinking that music includes everything. It's not just sounds made by instruments, it's not just sounds made by the human voice. It can be the sounds from nature, what we would call field recordings nowadays. It can just be what happens. It's the frame that we choose to put the sound in. So that's something that's very, very important to me, that art can contain anything, that you can put any material you want in there, and that there shouldn't be boundaries where we say, this is music, that's not music. Another story from my childhood. When I was growing up, the IRA were still active, and there was a spy program, a surveillance program in place called Echelon, which meant that every phone call that went out of Ireland was monitored by the British. Okay, so this was, everybody in the country understood this. We knew that this was happening. But when my sister and I were teenagers, we used to try to activate Echelon. So my mother would get very, very frustrated because my sister would be on the phone and she'd be saying, are you going to the disco? Do you think Dermot will be there? I love Dermot, he's gorgeous. Semtex, bombs! And my mother goes, stop it, because in my sort of family's ontology, by saying these keywords, a British spy somewhere in a room, a red light flashed, saying, listen into this phone call, it must be members of the IRA. And as a teenage girl, which is a demographic that doesn't feel like they have very much power or very much agency, the idea that you can activate a surveillance network through sound is extremely interesting and extremely powerful, because it makes you feel that maybe you're not just this random person in your bedroom, you're actually a node in a network. That you're embedded in a much bigger web that you're part of, in part of a huge ecology, rather than being an isolated individual. And so that sort of has stuck with me. This idea that sound is something that's cultural, it's something that's political, and it's also something which shows how we position ourselves in relationship to other people, how we exist as a society, how we exist as an ecology. The last one is to do with my granny. This is my granny, who I think is perhaps the greatest conceptual artist that ever lived. And the reason why is that when I was very small, I was about 6 years old, I heard a ringing in my ears, like a tinnitus, like a ringing in my ears. And I said to my granny, oh, my ear. And my granny said, what's wrong? And I said, I can hear this ringing in my ear. And my granny said, oh, that's the screaming of the souls in purgatory. Okay, so at that time in Ireland in the 80s, people actually believed that when you heard a ringing in your ears, you were wired in, to purgatory, and you could hear people screaming, but it was somehow filtered, so you just heard a long note instead of the actual screams. And at the time when she said this to me, I just sort of went, cool, that's very interesting, I can hear this screaming. So this idea of sound being something that it's sort of magical, It can be conceptual, it can be something that we think about, we can get information about it that makes us listen to it in a completely different way. That's very much part of my makeup and very much how I think about sound. That the stories we tell about sound frame how we perceive that sound. So these are sort of all different things that are very important to me. The idea that art can contain anything, that a piece of music can contain any type of material, that it's material which we view in a social, political, cultural context, and also that the conceptual apparatus and the way that we talk about sound influences how we listen to things. This is very, very key to the way that I think about sound. So, as an introduction to Aisteach, I want to just briefly talk about this project, Group Art, which we mentioned. Group Art was a project I started in 2007. So I started it at the height of the Celtic Tiger boom in Ireland. For those of you who are not aware of Irish economic history, from about 97 until the crash, we had the largest economic boom that ever happened in Ireland. So we went from being a country with 20% unemployment, where everybody left the country and nobody moved to Ireland, to being a country that loads of people moved into the country. Apple built a campus, Facebook built a campus, Microsoft built a campus. We gave them really good tax breaks, you know what I mean? So they wanted to stay there. We even said, don't pay us your taxes. And at that time, there was a building boom in Ireland. House prices went crazy, really, really crazy. A lot of people of my generation who'd left the country had a chance to go back home again, which was a huge shift. And we had a lot of investment in infrastructure and roads, which meant that a tiny percentage of every one of those budgets went to local communities to commission public art. So in Ireland, at that time, sort of 2005, 6, 7, they started commissioning very unusual public art projects. I'm sure in Berlin you have those sort of public art projects where it's a poem that's on the U-Bahn, you know, or sort of a bronze sculpture that's made out of casts of local people's hands, you know, at the motorway intersection. But in Ireland, they commissioned me to do a 2-year-long public art project where I said, I'm going to create a collective of people that don't exist. And I'm going to make all their work over 2 years, and I'll make compositions, sound installations, scores, drawings, sculptures, fashion, all sorts of different things. And they said, yeah, go for it, great. So it sort of felt like the Wild West of public art commissioning, and then the crash happened, and then all of the programs collapsed. But just before the crash happened, it was really amazing, because we could do these very unusual projects. So Group Art was the name of the collective that I formed. I'm going to talk about Group Art as if everybody's real. It's easier that way, but just they're all me. They're all my alter egos, so just remember that. When I started the project, one of the first things that I did was create a huge backstory. So I had to create a press catalog, a press book for Group Art as if they'd already existed for 7 years. So this was their first concert. We made ephemera, concert posters. So this in the story of Group Art, this was like the first concert poster that they made. One of the members of Group Art, Turf Boone, is a freegan, so he only will make art with materials that he finds, that have already been used. So he makes instruments like the Cushaltir marimba phone, which is an octave, if you can see there. So sort of these instruments that function both as instruments and both as sort of sculptural pieces. So what I tried to do with Group Art was have different personalities that I could work in extremely different ways. So with Turf, it was working all with materials that I found in dumpsters or in secondhand shops or things like that. It was a very specific way of working. Other members of Group Art, like Detleva Verens, who's an Estonian composer, she makes these sculptural objects, which are scores. So that's actually correct size. That's to scale in the projection. That's how big the object is. In the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific, the Marshallese Islanders make maps using sticks. And these are maps of the ocean. They're maps of currents in the ocean. So they're maps of energy flows rather than maps of topography. So I thought this was a perfect way to think about making scores, was to make a stick map, which is a map of different energy flows. So this was a piece that I've performed a lot as Detlef Verens. Other members of Groupad were people like Violetta Mahan, who's an outsider artist, who's obsessed with sound in a sort of almost religious way. So she makes these sonic reliquaries. If you have been into Catholic churches where they have like a golden arm and they say inside this arm is a bone from, you know, John the Baptist's arm. It's really John the Baptist's bone, we swear. So Violetta Mahan makes these reliquaries, but they all have sound at the core of them, sort of based on different African and traditional Christian reliquary structures. So these different identities were all important to me because they were ways to approach different ways of working. The Dowager Marchilove was the drag queen member of Groupad. So the Dowager Marchilove is a flaneur drag identity. So she goes for walks with a little dog that only has 3 legs, so it can't walk very fast, so that she can listen to sounds as she walks around Dublin. And these costumes were made for her. But one project that I came back to again and again from Groupad was this project. It's a sound installation. It's made by the alter ego, the Parks Service. And this is a sound installation that you go into a gallery and you see this little wooden hut and there's wood chips on the floor, so it smells like a forest, and camouflage webbing over the hut so it looks like a secret teenage boy lair. And when you go inside the hut, you see all these hand drawings. Does anybody ever play Dungeons and Dragons? Where I can see one person there. Usually people don't admit to playing role-playing games in public. So inside the sound installation are all of these drawings of the land of Emeraldia, which is actually based on a 4th century drawing of Ireland. So it's an entire role-playing game that's set in Ireland after the transhuman singularity has happened, and half on the internet, half in the future, very sort of detailed with all these different monsters like the chimeric mutants who emerged after the nuclear bombing of New York. And Ireland itself, Cork, has been blasted into the ocean after the second zombie uprising. So it's this very dragons and the internet and the future and transhumanism and mythological things all mixed together. When you go in, you have 2 different types of torches. I'm sorry, with the light, the image isn't so clear. So you have a UV torch, which shows you special secret information that's written on all of the drawings. But this project was really key for me because it was a way of trying to apply the future to Ireland, if that makes sense. Mostly when people come to Ireland, they come for something that's, 4,000 years old. They come to Ireland and they want to go to Newgrange and see Neolithic burial chambers, or they're American and they have family that stretches back, 50 or 100 years, and they want to try and trace that family. A lot of the art that comes out of Ireland is not science fiction. It's not set in the future. It's set in the past, or it's set in the countryside with an alcoholic father that can't communicate emotionally, and it's people living in a small town, in a farm in Ireland. And I really felt constricted by this because I thought, like, where's the sci-fi? Where's the future? Where's Ireland going? What's happening? And when I made this sound installation, I really was happy because I felt these things were squished together in a very weird, unexpected way. Because up to that point, I could not find any graphic novels or comics that were set in the future in Ireland, except for one copy of 2000 AD where Judge Dredd visits Ireland. Everything else was in the past. And I went round all of the comic book shops in Dublin, and I went in and I said, okay, I know that you've got Slania, which is the ancient warrior, comic book set in Ireland, but is there anything set, in the future, any sci-fi? And they all said, no, except for this one issue of Judge Dredd, which I then special ordered over the internet. And so I was thinking, well, why is this? Why don't we think in these ways? Because my sort of approach to trying to think about how we live life today and talk about it is influenced very much by the science fiction writer William Gibson. And William Gibson, he talks about the fact that if you were to describe the world that we live in now to a book editor or a book commissioner, let's say 5 years ago, I was to describe 2018 to a book commissioner, and I would say, I want to write this novel, it's set in the future, and Donald Trump's going to be president, you know, and the English will have voted for Brexit, do you know, and Harvey Weinstein has just been brought to his knees. People will go, no, that's just a bit too outlandish. That, you know, it sounds a bit far-fetched. That won't actually happen. So Gibson's sort of theory is that if we want to try and talk about what it's like to be alive today, we have to think like science fiction writers. We have to talk about right now as if it's the future, as if it's as strange as flying cars or something like that. So this sort of way of trying to sort of figure out how to work with Irishness, work with my sense of identity with being alive today, but working it through a science fiction way, recasting things, telling new stories about them, became very important to me. And I started doing projects like this. This is a dolmen in Ireland, in Auchnacliff. It's near my dad's house. It's about 4,000 years old. Wrapped around the top of it is a blanket that I crocheted, which features the Arecibo Message. The Arecibo Message was written by Carl Sagan in collaboration with other astronomers in 1974, and it was beamed out into space. And the idea was that this was how we would try to communicate with aliens. So the structure of the Arecibo Message has things like the basics of mathematics, because all scientists think that how we will communicate with alien races will be through mathematics. That will be the universal language. It has things like information about how many people live on Earth, what DNA is like, and how that's the makeup of our core. And so I started to do things like trying to basically recast Irish monuments, trying to sort of take the very old things like this dolmen that's 4,000 years old and say, okay, the dolmen is now, it's just a place for this message to exist as a picture, to look up into the skies. And at the same time, I began to do a series of works that I called With Special Thanks to the National Museum of Ireland, which have no hand in any of these works. That's just what they're called. So I would exhibit things that I would claim were on loan from the National Museum of Ireland, and I would use the National Museum of Ireland's logo illegally in the museum posters. So for example, I exhibited this, which I claimed was a micro stone circle, which I invented that term, the Knockvicker stone circle, and it was exhibited in Germany, it was exhibited in England, and people would say to me, oh, I saw the stone circle, and I could feel which was the most important stone, you know, and I could feel this power of these stones, and I would say, that's fantastic. You know, I was very, very happy. Nobody ever said to me, there's actually grass and moss growing on one of these stones. Do you know? It should be very clear that they were taken out of a field, you know what I mean, a week prior to the first exhibition. But I really loved it because it seemed to me that Irishness was this weird medium which allowed people to have this imaginary experience. Is that I could use Irishness like a medium to let people suspend their belief rather than their disbelief and have this experience. I don't do this to fool people. I don't want anybody to feel, oh no, I didn't realize it was fake. I do it just to try and open up this space so that there's a parallel universe where this thing is real, and the artwork simply brings that parallel universe into contact with us. Other works I made from this series were Robert Boyle's alchemical apparatus. So near where my house is in Ireland, which is in Knockvicker, which is why this is the Knockvicker stone circle, near where my house is in Ireland is the town of Boyle. Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, extremely important scientist, was actually born in Ireland. And through a lot of research, I found a letter that Isaac Newton, this is real, Isaac Newton wrote Robert Boyle a letter after Robert Boyle had managed to complete a specific alchemical procedure. And Isaac Newton said, you can't let the world know, it's too dangerous. You know, this was sort of very Dan Brown type thing, that like these two guys, you know, Newton and Boyle are writing to each other about alchemy. So I did a lot of research. I did a lot of research into the structures of alchemical vessels, and my father, who's a potter, made all of these vessels to the designs that I came up with. And we exhibited these in New York, in London, in lots of different places, and we always said, oh, these are Robert Boyle's alchemical apparatus, which shows that the father of modern chemistry was an alchemist right through to the end of his life. And again, nobody has ever said that's not correct. You know, or like, no, come on, Robert Boyle, father of modern chemistry, like he's what's dragged us away from alchemy. But instead, people interact with them, they look at them, they look at details. People say things like, oh, you can see the way all the chemicals have like burned into the alembic or the pelican flask or things like that. And for me, that was really interesting because again, it just opens up this space. So that brings me to this project, Aisteach, which is probably the biggest space or the largest point of contact between two parallel universes that I've managed to make at this point. This is a very, very large-scale project. It involved a huge amount of collaborators. If you go to the website, you can read all of the different articles. You can listen to lots and lots of different music on the website. There's a book that I'll pass around now that you can buy from it. Basically, you buy it from Lulu. It's a print-on-demand book, so you don't pay us, you just pay Lulu to print it and post it to you. The music is also available on iTunes. It involved a lot of people, sound engineers, musicians, musicologists, experimental musicians, all sorts of different people. Because what I wanted to create was an archive of completely fictional historical Irish avant-garde music. And the reason I wanted to do this is because there isn't any in Ireland. There was no data in Ireland, there was no fluxus in Ireland. It was a very poor country, which meant that there wasn't enough money to sustain a middle class that would produce avant-garde music. When I was researching the project, I went back, I thought I have to be really, really sure. And looking through archives, I couldn't find any avant-garde stuff. There's a very strong tradition, you know, of avant-garde writing in Ireland. We have Beckett, we've Joyce, we've Flann O'Brien, who is a massive, massive influence on me. But I couldn't find comparative composers. I could find composers like Ina Boyle, who wrote fantastic music, and she went off to London and studied there, as a lot of the sort of the upper middle class Irish composers did. But they wrote sort of quite classical orchestral music. They didn't write avant-garde stuff. So when I wanted to do this project, I talked to a lot of different musicians, a lot of different people around Ireland, and not just Irish people, also people in the States. And, you know, when I said to them, what would you invent? Instantly people had ideas. They had ideas of things that they wanted to have existed. And I'll say that again, because I know not everybody speaks English. We wanted to write things, we wanted to invent things that we wished had really existed. That was what was very important. With very little work, with very little oversight, the gender, it's almost completely 50-50 in terms of gender. We've also got like drag queens doing queer sound poetry nights where they perform Kirchwitters. You know, it's a very diverse community within Aisteach, and that came from the people who wrote the stories, because we all wanted that. We were trying to write a past so that we could create a future that we wanted from that past, okay? So that's sort of how the project worked. So if you go to aisteach.org, it looks like a nice, you know, a nice non-government arts organization that has a little bit of funding. It's sort of nice design, but not too nice. You know, it's not trying to look like, what's the design shop, Bulthaup you have here? You know, so it sort of looks okay. Our model was Ubu. So we wanted it to look like Ubu Web, that it would function as it says up there, the avant-garde archive of Ireland. So the rule with Aisteach when we made the project was that it could start, you know, probably the earliest project we have is from the mid-19th century. But it had to end in 1985 because that's when the Contemporary Music Centre of Ireland was opened. So that was the rule. So there's lots and lots of different projects in here. They involved a huge amount of research, because we had to try and figure out how we could really make people believe these things existed. We couldn't just say, oh, there was an Irish symphony orchestra and there was an Irish equivalent of Beethoven, because that wasn't true. People would know that that was fake. So how can we find little tiny cracks in history where maybe a little seed could grow? So that's where research came in, that sometimes led to very, very strange places. And this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of sound being something political. So everybody always thinks that this is photoshopped, but it's not. This is a real newspaper cover. It's a real newspaper cover. It's from October 28th, 1973. And it says, "Black Magic Fear in 2 Border Towns." Now this newspaper cover, the story, Black Magic Fear in 2 Border Towns, was planted by the British Army. Because between 1973 and 1974, the British Army had a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign, where they planted over 70 stories, completely fake, about Satanism and black magic worship, because they were trying to connect Satanism with terrorism. Because they thought that if young people thought that the IRA and the UVF were Satanists, they wouldn't join the IRA or the UVF. Okay, so this is completely crazy that they thought, you know, people who wanted to join the IRA, who wanted to like bomb English people, would say, no, the IRA are into Satan worship. So no, I won't join the IRA as a result. It was crazy. So they manipulated the press. They planted all these stories, both in the Republic of Ireland as well as in the north of Ireland. The Exorcist was in the cinemas, and The Devil Rides Out was in the cinemas. So people would come out of The Exorcist completely terrified, and then they'd see a story about IRA people being into worshipping Satan, and they'd be completely terrified again. Not many people know this. There's a book about it by a British sociologist. But when we found this when we read about this PSYOPs campaign, we thought, oh, okay, so we have this duo called Kilbride and Malone duo. And Kilbride and Malone are Niall Kilbride and Karen Malone, and they're like a free complete noise improvisation duo. And they write this very, very aggressive drums and saxophone music. And we thought, okay, so we're going to take Karen and Niall's music, and it's going to be left playing at one of the fake black magic mass sites with a sheep carcass that the British in reality actually did. And because it sounds like the people playing the music are possessed, so we'll leave this recording playing there. So that's how we started to find little places where the music could exist. It's just by looking through history and trying to find these tiny weird little holes in history where we thought, oh, we can insert our music into that narrative. Other places were things like the Guinness Dadaists. So, like I said, there's no history of Dada in Ireland. So looking back and trying to create a Dadaist movement involved looking for a place where the Dadaists could have worked. Because our Dadaists had to be working class, which meant that they needed to work at a place that had decent labor laws. And Guinness, I know this because my dad worked there and my granddad worked there, Guinness were very encouraging towards their workers. If they did drawings, they would exhibit them. They really tried to sort of foster a sort of the cultural development of the working class people who worked at Guinness. On top of that, Guinness also had the best labor laws. They had the most humane labor laws in Europe at the time. And this was in Ireland in the 20s, where Dublin had the worst slums in Europe, in the whole of Europe. So it was a very, very poor city. So that's where I put my Dadaists, is I thought, okay, maybe Dadaism could have happened at Guinness. And it could have happened because it was a culture where making art was encouraged in the workers, and art was displayed, and they maybe would have had space to actually sort of do their work. Because at that time, Irish people were sort of, if you look at like what was going on in painting, you had a lot of Irish painters who were sort of painting what they saw on the continent. You had painters who were sort of in the W.B. Yeats Celtic revivalist mode, who were painting lots of beautiful mythological pictures, but there was nothing that connected with Dada. So my Dadaists work at Guinness, as it was in the 20s, they're very different than the European or the American Dadaists because they're not pacifists. They were against the First World War, but the Irish were engaged in a civil war against the British at the same time as the First World War. And my Irish Dadaists were part of the Civil War, which separates them out from European Dadaism because they weren't completely pacifists. They weren't completely against war. So all of these photographs, these were all photographs I found on the internet. They were photographs that people posted with, where they said, public domain, you can do whatever you want with these photographs. So these were all things that I didn't just steal photographs and not credit the sources. These were things that specifically the makers had tagged, as being something that was sort of open source. So my Guinness Dadaists, this is one of the Dadaists. This is what we call the old IRA. In Ireland, prior to the terrorist IRA, we had the IRA, who were the Irish Republican Army, who were part of the Civil War against the British. So this is a photograph of old IRA, non-terrorist IRA volunteers that includes one of my Dadaists, Brian Sheridan. I found notebooks that were actually originally by J.M. Singh, the Irish playwright. I appropriated them from the Trinity College Library as notebooks, which were diagrams of Dadaist performances that occurred by the Guinness Dadaists, things like that. And I created scores using the Irish language. I mentioned to you that the Irish language is very, very difficult to pronounce. So my Irish Dadaist sound poetry is extremely impossible for people who are non-native Irish speakers to read. Okay, and this for the Guinness Dadaists was very deliberate. It was a way of sort of safeguarding part of their culture. So they made sound poetry, which is going to be highly complex for people to even speak, because you're going to have to learn, if I read the words in the lower right-hand corner, it says flusk lecht goed chussen egge. So it's complicated for people to learn. The only other person who's learned these is Tomomi Adachi, the Japanese improviser who lives here in Berlin, because he considers the Guinness Dadaists to have a connection with Japanese Mavo. So that's where things get very complicated. Other members of Ashtag are people like, in fact, I'll go forward one slide, people like Pádraig McGeola Wirra. One sort of musical aspect which cropped up again and again in Ashtag was drone. Was so many different people wrote personae into existence that involved drone in the sound. So for me, Pádraig McGeola Wirra is very, very important because I sort of situate him in 1953. I situate, basically when people encounter Pádraig McGeola Wirra's work, they encounter it in a museum situation where there's a listening post, which has a PDF of the release of Pádraig McGeola Wirra's CD, and it has photoshopped Ellis Island emigration records, which record two different people, Maggie Malarkey and Michael Murray, who met on board the SS Carania going to New York in 1921. Those are real Ellis Island emigration records. I photoshopped these names into them. They met on board the ship, they fell in love, they ended up in New York, they had this son, Patrick, or as we say in Ireland, Pádraig. When Pádraig was grown up, his father got ill and died of tuberculosis, so they moved back to Ireland, which mimics what happened with my grandparents. And my great-grandparents and my grandparents. And the story goes that back in Ireland, Pádraig is completely distraught because his father is dead, and his father was an uilleann pipes player. And the uilleann pipes, you have this bag under your uilleann, your elbow, which has these drones at the core of it. And so I made this music that I claimed had been recorded in 1953 This is the time that Alan Lomax and people like that were traveling around Ireland and recording folk music. It was recorded, I claim that it was recorded by the Irish Folklore Commission. I'll let you hear it before I say anything more. Stop there. So the idea with this music, with Dúrdan, was that you have music that's created which has these long drones within it. Within the Irish language, there's a lot of different words for drone. It's sort of like Eskimos talking about snow. You have the drone of bees, the drone of pipes, the drone of all these different things. Dúrdan comes from the Irish name Deirdre, because in Irish mythology, when Deirdre was in her mother's womb, when her mother was pregnant with her, she screamed and did these long notes that were screamed. So it's this idea of almost like screaming, that being these long song-held notes. When I made Dúrdan, what I was trying to do was create an alternative history for minimalism, where minimalism was born in Irish outsider folk music rather than in New York. And it was a way of bypassing the argument over whether Philip Glass or Steve Reich, or they stole it from Terry Riley, or Lamont Young, kept all the tapes of the Theatre of Eternal Music and wouldn't release them. So it was my way of sort of trying to bypass that history and give an alternative history. And Tony Conrad, who you mentioned, is involved very much in that argument over where minimalism sort of came from, because he was involved in the Theatre of Eternal Music with Lamont Young, and Lamont Young has all of these recordings that he won't allow anybody have access to. So for me, it was a way of bypassing that and positioning a new type of history. The first time I ever showed Dúrdan was in the Chelsea Art Museum. I did a show there, and it was in the show. And what I found was that New Yorkers had no problem with this. They loved that it bypassed all these arguments. And they were like, great, it started in 1953 in Cork. The fight's over. We don't have to argue over who invented this anymore. And this is what's been very interesting to me about this project, is that nobody's ever got angry with me. On the website, if you go to the website, there's a disclaimer. Sorry, first of all, it says About Ashtalk. And if you go to the About Ashtalk, it claims that the site was made by a poet and a composer, a man and a woman working together. And then there's a disclaimer. And if you click on disclaimer, there's a statement where you see my name, and it says that this is a thought experiment. This is really an experiment in imagining what could have happened if the country hadn't been so poor, if there hadn't been an occupying force, if there hadn't been a church that was incredibly repressive. And what I found is that I will get emails from people where they might say, I might get an email at like 2 in the morning that says, hey, just reading the website, keep up the good work, hope your funding stays. And then I get an email an hour later that says, I just read the disclaimer, keep up the good work, because it is a very open project, and it allows anybody who listens to it or looks at it to participate in it. Because once it meets other people, that's where the project lives. The project doesn't live because I made it and it's in a book. It lives because everybody tries to imagine this alternative world where these things could have happened. And what tends to happen, especially in Ireland, is people come up and they say, have you ever thought of having a guy called, Mickey O'Rice, and he only makes music with potatoes? And people have ideas, and they say, oh, you should do this. There should be this gang of like schoolgirls that did this weird operatic performance. And critics and reviewers who write about the project tend to invent their own projects and put them in their own articles about Ashtalk. So it works in a very, very different way as a result. Probably one of the most popular figures is Sister Anselme in the project, who is a nun who lives in an enclosed order. And I'm very happy to mention her because within the context of the project, creating the recordings that went on the website was quite technologically complex, because we wanted the recordings to sound like the time when they were supposed to have been made. So, for example, Sister Anselme, who we claim lived in a convent in Galway in an enclosed order, so she never spoke to other people. And she used to make these really weird drone compositions for organ as a way of praying. That was her sort of strange praying. We claim that the only reason we have access to these recordings is because a German radio station with a feminist musicologist was doing a survey of women who lived in enclosed religious orders and the music that they made. And all of the recordings on the website, we had to make them maximum fidelity, highest possible quality, and then we had to sort of deliberately damage them so that they sounded like they'd been made in 1940 or they'd been made for a monophonic radio broadcast, but we tried to widen out so they were a little bit stereo. You know, so this was a very interesting part of it, because the technology, the way that we approach the technology of it, allowed us to play with these conventions of what an archive is and how an archive functioned. The most extreme example was one of the musicians, Nick Roth. He made a 45-minute long recording of one of the best uilleann pipe players in Ireland, just playing the drones on his uilleann pipes for 45 minutes. So normally an uilleann piper will start it up and then they're doing all this crazy, amazing stuff, really ornate, you know, melodic work. But instead, Nick said, no, just don't do anything. Just keep the pipes going. So it was just a 45-minute long drone recording where you can hear traffic in the background. And we had to pretend that this had been made on wax cylinders. So we had to say, okay, wax cylinder about 1 minute long. So chop the whole thing up into 45-minute long segments. Treat all of those with the EQ so that it sounds like it was recorded on a wax cylinder, so completely degrade the recording. Take a recording of wax cylinder crackles and put that on top of everything. Now sew them back together and do what digital people would do when they're restoring the recording. So often the recordings went through 10 or 11 different processes before they ended up on the website, so that we had something which we felt was true, that people would believe it, because they didn't all sound like they'd been made in the same room or on the same instruments or with the same microphone. So we tried a lot of different tricks to do that. So the last thing I'll mention is Caoimhin Breathnach. Because this is probably the identity which for me has kept going outside of Ashtalk. So Caoimhin Breathnach, he's an outsider artist. He lived in Knockvicar. Breathnach means Walsh in Irish. So if we're in Ireland and I say his name is Caoimhin Breathnach, people say, oh, is he a relative? And I say, yes, he was my great uncle. And when he died, I bought his cottage, and it was full of outsider art. And so that's how I have access to his archive. That's the narrative that I have. But it's quite strange because he's probably the most important persona from the whole thing to me, because I consider my house in Ireland to be his house. You know, I exhibit things that I claim are from his archive, and he's sort of the parallel version of me. Like, in another universe, I'm the outsider artist Caoimhin Breathnach, who lived as a recluse, who died alone in his cottage, full of bin bags, full of tapes, you know, that he treated. And within sort of his mythology, he creates these tapes. He calls them subliminal tapes because they're supposed to have a magical effect on you. When you listen to them, they'll change your consciousness. So he'll record sound onto cassettes and wrap them in crystals, bury them, put them in buckets of blood, spray them with holy water, burn them, all these different processes. He keeps these elaborate diaries. This is an Irish script called Orgel. This is a diary about how he was trying to cure his stomach problems by recording these certain sounds onto the tape and then wrapping it onto tying it to his stomach so that he'd go to sleep, and the tape would somehow affect his stomach. He also made musical instruments. This is again this Irish alphabet, Orgel, that's burned into the instruments, which are these weird, broken down sort of drone violins, things like that. This is a sort of a Ouija board made from Orgel, so he would use this for divination purposes so that he could make decisions about when to bury tapes, how to process them, things like that. So the very last thing I'll just show you is just a couple of minutes of a film that I made called Gehört. And this grew out of Ashtach. After the project was launched, I was approached by Cork Film Festival, and Cork Film Festival asked me to make a film. And I said, okay, well, why don't I make a film that Caoimhin wanted to make and he never got to finish? And Cork Film Festival said, yes, we'll have commissioned the film in 1985, but the Archbishop of Cloyne banned it for being, heretical. So it was very strange to work with a film festival who were saying, yeah, let's all pretend that we commissioned this film from your great uncle, and then we axed the contract. So now you're making, as his inheritor of his legacy, you will finally make this film, and it will put the world to rights in that sort of a way. And so it's a film that allowed me very much to work in and around Roscommon, work with a lot of local folklore. So, for example, in some Irish folklore, hydrangea petals are supposed to be they're supposed to have psychedelic qualities. So people would smoke them or try to ingest them to have sort of psychedelic visions. There's also different Irish folk sites. I know it's difficult maybe with the light, but in Ireland we have these sites, they're called holy wells, and they're usually pagan sites that a Christian church was built on top of. So you have these phenomena called rag trees, and what people do is they go to these trees at the holy well sites and they tie things on the trees, and they believe that when these things rot away and break off the tree, they will be granted their prayer. So people in the old days would tie little bits of cloth and they'd pray, I hope the baby gets better, or, I hope my granny's operation goes well. But nowadays they tie things like headphones. I went to this well, in fact, about a week ago, and there was like 5 pairs of sunglasses tied to it. And you're thinking, these are never going to rot away. You know what I mean? Like your granny's operation will never go well because these things, they're supposed to rot away. That's the point of rag trees. But I was able to go in and use sites like this with almost no intervention, that they already sort of existed. But instead of feeling that I needed to use them in this entirely accurate way, I could use them within this weird system, this occult system of Caoimhin Breathnach, where tapes and videos and things like that are very, very much part of that. So I'll just show you just a couple of minutes from this film, and then...
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Jennifer, für diese wunderbaren Einblicke in die Arbeit. Sind jetzt Fragen? Möchten Sie über ein bestimmtes Thema diskutieren? Ja? Moment bitte, wir haben ein Mikrofon für Sie.
Yes, my name is Thorsten Flü. I worked with UCD from 1997 to 2000, so I know a little bit about Irishness. And of course, your concept of Irishness is not an academic one. So please tell me or tell us a little bit more about your concept, and perhaps is it only ironical or is it a serious work? How would you describe your work about Irishness?
There's no irony at all. I don't ever have irony in my work. I think it's very serious play in that to try and make an alternative history for something, to try and make an alternative history that didn't exist is a serious project, because you're trying to write something into existence that you felt was stamped out, you know, that wasn't possible. When I made the Ashtok project, different people sent me their articles that they'd finished, there was a lot of violence and grief and mental illness and physical illness. There was so much pain in all of these narratives, because really for us it felt like things had been very, very difficult. You know, so there's different identities. One of them, Teresa Flynn, who Stephen Graham, an Irish musicologist, wrote her identity. And when I read it for the first time, she, in a very classical Irish narrative, she's given a medal in Germany for her services to music pedagogy and dies in obscurity in Ireland. You know, and I cried when I read it, because that's been the narrative of a lot of Irish artists, is that they're not accepted in Ireland. James Joyce said, you know, any sensible Irish person flees the country as soon as they're able to, but he also said, when I die, Dublin will be written in my heart. So this is this conflict, you know, of a place that you love, and how do you figure it out? And I mean, for me, it's Irishness, but for many of us, it's just our identity, where we're from, our family background. How do we negotiate those things? So there's no irony. It's just to try to create a space where we can think about these things or think about alternatives.
Noch weitere Fragen? Ich hätte jetzt noch eine Frage, weil ich das so wunderbar finde, was sie dazu sagt, und zwar beim Unterrichten. Nowadays, somebody who wants to become a composer in Germany, he always has to play the piano very wonderfully, nearly as a professional piano player, to get admission to study composing. What would you ask for as an opener, or to get admission to studying composition? Also was würde sie voraussetzen als für Leute, die Komposition studieren möchten?
I think I would, even if people don't know how to do it yet, I think as part of just the general curriculum, I think all composers should learn video. I think anybody in Musikhochschule, if you go to an art school, everybody knows everybody knows basic video editing, even if they won't pursue a career as a video editor or making films, they know that. But I also think, certainly in Musikhochschule, there should be general classes about technological literacy, you know, what it is to use the internet, what it means when we use it. And also classes about gender and sexuality, because for a lot of musicians, they have a very strange relationship with their bodies, you know, and so I think those things should be in the mix.
Is it a hate-love with the internet?
The internet, that would be like saying, is it hate-love with electricity or the postal service? In that the internet is an infrastructure. You know, it is something, it is not separate to us. We are completely embedded in it. And I suppose with my students, what I try to teach them to do is be aware of that. You know, one of the problems I think that we have with new music is that there's a hypocrisy where most composers would consider themselves left. They would consider themselves even socialists, you know, or Marxists. But everybody's on Facebook providing free content, you know, giving away their labor for free, you know, in order to be served advertising and arguing about who's the better leftist on Facebook. So that would be where I see irony. You know? So I think that sort of there's the British academic Marina Warner. She talks about academia, and she talks about the fact that the general picture of an academic, which I think is the same as an artist, is somebody who loves what they do so much that they'll do it 10 hours a day, 14 hours a day, they'll work weekends, they'll do it in their summer holidays. And that maps very, very nicely onto neoliberalism. Because it means neoliberalism doesn't have to do anything to create artists who are going to work stupid hours and do it for very little money. So I think these are things, I don't know the correct answer, but I try to talk to my students about them.
Hope you will be very influential. Thank you very much,
Thanks very much.
Jennifer Walshe.